So welcome for this, the fourth session of the Essence of History seminar series. This week, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Hans Ruhn from Soliciting University, where Hans founded the philosophy department in 1999. He's also the co-founder and former president of the Nordic Society for Phenomenology. Professor Ruhn's main research interests include phenomenology, hermeneutics, especially Heidegger and Nietzsche, modern French thought, especially Derrida and Foucault, and ancient Greek philosophy, particularly Heraclitus, as well as the theory of history and memory, the philosophy of religion, and the philosophy of technology. In 1994, Hans published his PhD thesis, Enigmatic Origin, tracing the theme of historicity through Heidegger's works. Since then, Hans has published a number of essays on Heidegger and hermeneutic philosophy, the most recent of which is the 10-page entry on historicity in the recently released History, Theory and Method published by Bloomsbury. For 6 years, Professor Ruhn led a multidisciplinary research program called Time, Memory and Representation on the transformations in historical consciousness in collaboration with, among others, Hayden White, Frank Ankerschmidt, and Joan Scott. It was in the context of this project that Hans wrote his most recent work, Being with the Dead, Burial, Ancestral Politics, and the Roots of Historical Consciousness, published in 2018. It's my absolute pleasure then to hand over to Hans now for his paper, Soliciting and Speaking for the Dead, History as Necromancy. Hans.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you everyone for coming. When Odysseus is received at the court of King Alcinous with a feast in Homer's Odyssey, he is asked to recount the story of his adventures from the war. And he speaks then for several hours about all these remarkable and terrible things that he has experienced in the years that have passed since leaving Troy. At one point, the king then asks a bard, the court bard, Demodocus, to sing also these stories from the Great War, which by then have become folk mythology. So it's in the presence of one of the protagonists who actually experienced these events that the story of them are recounted in a poetic form. Could the person who has the mic turned on maybe turn it off? Sorry. Okay. Are we good, Aaron? Yeah, okay. So in the framework of the narrative, the protagonist who has experienced the events also listen to them in the form that they are sung by the bard, in a quite remarkable example of an early meta-literature. In one of the essays in the collection Between Past and the Future, Hannah Arendt points to this particular scene with Odysseus listening to the bard as the beginning, as she says, of history, where myth and historical facticity meet in the image of this encounter between the bard and the actual hero. Toward the end here, I will return to this particular passage from the Odyssey in order to make a somewhat different point. And I will argue then that we do indeed encounter an original sense of the historical in the Homeric epic. It is, however, not primarily situated in the contrast between the real hero and the bard's mythical account. Instead, we find it in the story of Odysseus' journey to the land of the dead, of which he gives a very powerful and moving account during this same night at the banquet of the king. So my thesis here that I also develop at greater length in the book that Aaron mentioned, Being with the Dead, is that it is in the report from the land of the dead, which is enabled by a sacrificial passage right across the threshold of time, that we can find an early model for what I speak of as the ethos of historical narrative, and thus also of historical awareness itself in early Greek literature. Indeed, it is here that we maybe touch something like the essence of history. But in order to reach this point, I will move through Heidegger's account of historicity in being and time, in conjunction with this analysis of how Dasein also is with the dead, that there is a genuine being with the dead that is also thematized in this work. And then after a brief meditation on Hegel and his Antigone, I return towards the end again to Homer as this original articulation of both communication with and separation from the dead, in a way that can also let us relate this whole argument to Michel de Certeau. So this is the arc of what I will do. I think I'll speak for about 40 minutes. So from where can we approach a phenomenon like the essence of history? Is there even such a thing? Is there history as something that we can explore in terms of how it is meant, given, and constituted for an experiencing subject? Is not this purported phenomenon, or that which is recognized under its name, already from the start, multifaceted and dispersed? The Greeks, as we know, did not have a specific word for it, since Greek historia rather means inquiry, from the verb historeo, to inquire or examine, but also to give an account. It's also been traced by philologians back to the word histor as the agent of an archaic perfective form of having seen, oida, designating then the one who knows from having seen or learned. In the Iliad, there are a few places where a histor is mentioned, and then it is as a knowledgeable and authoritative person, and it's translated as judge or arbiter. In some cases, histor can also designate a witness. So from this evidence, maybe if we try to create a kind of tentative definition of the historian, it could be something like an inquiring witness who recounts what has been seen. This is also more or less how the term appears in Herodotus, in that genre of writing that from this moment onward is recognized precisely as history. The historian would then be an inquirer into that which has taken place, in order, as Herodotus writes at the outset, to, I quote, to preserve from decay the remembrance of what men have done. Its object is not an entity, not history or the past as such, but rather the deeds of men, and with the purpose of preventing them from disappearing into oblivion. It is only later that the term history also becomes a name for the object of this inquiring narration, and ultimately as equivalent to the totality of past events. This same inherent ambiguity of the term history, Geschichte, is addressed by Heidegger in section 73 of Being and Time, where he turns toward the general phenomenological problem of the historical. And he writes there, the most obvious ambiguity of the term history has often been noted. It means historical reality, as well as the possibility of a science of it. He also comments on the ambiguity surrounding the temporal nature of the historical. Though generally recognized as having to do with the past, it is still often also posited as that which somehow is still present, exerting its influence in and on the present. History, as he says, in a sort of summarizing definition, is the occurrence of something that is both present and past, as handed down while still having an effect. The historicity of an artifact, what we speak of as its historical nature, is not something that it carries within itself as a kind of immanent essence. Everything that exists that we have before us is obviously there in the present. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to see and experience it. But one and the same artifact can both be seen as belonging to this present and yet also belonging to the past. And whether or not it achieves this index of the historical seems to depend on its context of use. The particular sense layer of historical can only be accounted for, this is Heidegger's concluding argument, by seeing how artifacts indicate, as he writes, a world within which they were encountered as things at hand, belonging to a context of useful things and used by heedful Dasein existing in the world. In other words, it is in virtue of being connected to Dasein as past, as having been there, that something appears as history and thus is possible as having the index historical. If, however, Dasein as past is simply another way of saying Dasein is no longer there, then his attempt to achieve a phenomenological definition would seem to move in circles, because in order to define the meaning of history as the peculiar phenomenon of this present past, we would seem to rely again on the existence precisely of past Dasein, in other words, non-present Dasein, and thus on the very notion that the whole investigation was meant to clarify, namely precisely the possibility of experiencing something as historical and yet being here and now. What Heidegger then invites through his analysis his reader to contemplate is a kind of peculiar lingering on of the past in the present, that which can mark certain things present as also things past, and that which thus also open the historical as a kind of breach or lacuna in the fabric of the present. In his continued effort to secure this phenomenological sense of pastness, he will develop then in the course of the following sections of the book his analysis of the historicity of Dasein as a structure of authentic repetition, Wiederholung, where the main purpose of the account is to understand how Dasein is historical in virtue of constituting itself as a reenactment and rehearsal of past possibilities for a future. I did not repeat the details of this analysis, which would be familiar to most of you. I just want to make a more general point about sort of the whole orientation of his attempt to prepare for the other side of my own argument. So we can ask them, from where does this meaning of pastness then emerge? And Heidegger says, he recognizes this is really the enigma that we are facing, a Rätsel. And he acknowledges that we usually take for granted that being historical amounts to just having a tiny part in the great business of world history. Yet we can and should still ask the philosophical question on the basis of what ontological condition this historicity belongs to the subjectivity of the historical subject itself as its essential condition. And he suggests that we think of this no longer being of human existence as I said, having been there, a Dagewesen, a perfected version of Dasein. He could then perhaps have said Dasein as non-living, because it is as if, even though he doesn't use the term here in this section, it is as if the dead here appear as part of the argument, as the implicit source of the meaning of the historical itself, as the other side of this strange lingering on of what is past through this middle region of a perfective being. Heidegger, of course, wants to stay true to the phenomenological prerogative that we seek the meaning of a phenomenon on the basis of its lived future projection of understanding from where we are. But when it comes to the meaning of the past, it's as if he's compelled thus to recognize that the very meaning of pastness somehow must imply the pastness of the other, and not then as an entity, that comes to us from a presumed objective past, which is strangely preserved in the present, but rather as this peculiar pastness in the present to which we still somehow belong, or of which we are a part. In this phenomenological sense, history is thought as a kind of derivation. The German word is Herkunft. It's a form of pastness that seems to carry or drag the past with it, while at the same time being present. And this term Herkunft, that the English translation has derivation, I think is notable. But Heidegger does not explore it further, because Kunft or Kunft in older German is a word for coming, and thus of the arrival, or simply that which is to come. So the Herkunft, would that mean that from which something has come or originated, in other words, as ancestry. Heidegger himself does not speak explicitly of ancestry or the ancestral, the standard German term for which would be probably Abstammung or Vorfahren, but his own continued phenomenological analysis of the meaning of the historical will lead him instead to focus on this parallel term of Dasein as having been, as Dagewesen. My motivation for suggesting a term like ancestry or ancestrality into discussion has to do with this positive ambiguity, how it designates a kind of in-between life and death. And it's a challenge for any phenomenology of history to give an account precisely of the possibility of the historicity of an event or artifact as this present absence in the present. And the ancestral would then be one way of capturing the phenomenological quality of that which in the present recalls and reaches back into what presents itself as past. In that sense, it designates a core problem of a phenomenology of history, namely the meaning of present past, or in Heidegger's term, Herkunftigkeit or Dagewesenheit. So by bringing this very issue of Dasein as Dagewesen, as having been, into the discussion, Heidegger has clearly pointed towards a deeper exploration of this phenomenology of the non-present other for our understanding of the historical. His analysis of historicity shows how the circular and projective temporality of existence is a prerequisite for historical understanding of awareness. But more generally and importantly, it shows the need of exploring the existential roots of history, taken also in its theoretical scientific form as the ideal true account of how it really was. Because having an understanding relation to the past and living meaningfully in relation to the past is not something that requires or rests on history as an academic or theoretic literary enterprise. That is clear. On the contrary, the theoretical pursuit that we identify with academic history that seeks to secure the truth about the past is obviously a later and perhaps even secondary event in the evolution of something like the phenomenon of history, historical experience, historical awareness, which then would seem to be existentially rooted in what we could perhaps speak of also as a transgenerational mode of existing, in which we are involved in a repetition and preservation with those who are no longer there, in short, with the dead. In a small book, Aporias, from 1993, Derrida brings together a series of meditations on death that were partly motivated by his own reading of Philippe Ariès, the French cultural historian and anthropologist, his monumental study of the culture of death, L'Homme devant la mort, that came out in the 77. And here Derrida devotes an explicit critical analysis to Heidegger and his existential analysis of death. And he concludes that, I quote, "The existential analytic does not want to have anything to do with the revenant and with grief." These remarks explicitly recall the critical analysis of Heidegger's analysis of death that Levinas had also developed in his last lecture course from the mid-70s that was then published in the early 90s. In these lectures, he also criticized Heidegger precisely for reducing the role and meaning of the death of the other in favor of concentrating only on personal finitude. And of course, this criticism from Levinas and Derrida and also others is valid in some respects, but I think their judgment is too quick. There are ways in which Heidegger himself, even though if only in passing, also comes across the same theme of this strange ontological middle ground of the dead other and how this engages us. And his general point in Being in Time is, of course, that we should not, when we try to understand death, what the meaning of death, that's a phenomenological problem, we should not take the medical, biological, or social so-called fact of death for granted as our source of knowledge and reflection for understanding mortality. For death, he writes, is ultimately a phenomenon of Dasein as possibility, or in a sense, always my death, the fact that I am finite. And that I carry the possibility of my non-possibility. Still, he does actually devote a passage to the meaning of the death of the other as part of section 47, where the argument goes somewhat as follows. He writes then that when the other Dasein reaches its completion, as another word for dying, it's Gänse, it turns into, he says, a no longer being in the world. This is the first phenomenal aspect of being as dead. But how should we understand this phenomenon of so-called leaving the world? We say of the dead that they have left the world. They are no longer living. In one sense, the other Dasein is, of course, no longer there. But in another sense, he or she is still there, but now as the apparent thing of a being no longer alive. So in the dying of others, Heidegger writes, a remarkable phenomenon occurs, namely the sudden transition or reversal, an Umschlag of Dasein, or of life, to a no longer Dasein. It is as if the end of Dasein were suddenly the beginning of another type of being or entity, but now in the order of a purely present entity, namely as a corpse. But this standard or normal conventional description of what takes place at the moment of death doesn't capture the phenomenal aspect or character of this event. More precisely, it fails to capture the sense in which this being, as he writes, is still remaining, noch verbleibende, and as such not really represented by the purely corporeal, sort of the dead corpse. It is not just lifeless, he says, leblos, it is rather unliving, it's unlebendig. And it is in this form that it can also become the object of multiple types of concerns, of saga. He writes us in the funeral rites and in the cults, etc. The mourners who mourn the dead are still with the other in the mode of a care that is characteristic of being with others. It's not the kind of care that you devote to object. You don't take care of corpses the way you take care of things. To be a mourner is to be with the remains of the dead. A dead body is very different from an artifact. We continue, he writes, to be with them in a world that continues to give meaning and significance to our peculiar mode of being with those who are no longer there, even though they have, as it were, left it behind. And it is in this passage that he explicitly uses the term that there is a sense in which we are with the dead. There is a sein mit dem Toten that cannot be reduced to a sein mit in this ordinary sense of intersubjectivity, nor is it a being or comportment in relation to things. And this analysis is carried out very briefly because it's not his purpose to devote any much attention to it, because he's in these sections, his main goal is rather to insist that in order to understand mortality as our own finitude, we should not be guided by the experience of the disappearance of the other, as if the truth of our own death is simply there in collective dying. But even still, he comes across when he comes across the phenomenon itself, he sees and molds these concepts to speak of this ontological middle ground. It's as if the sheer force of this experiential phenomenality leads him to the irreducible problem of the phenomenology of the afterlife, or maybe even to a kind of spectral existence, to speak with Derrida, who in his later writings, as you know, would construct a whole new vocabulary to speak precisely of all of these absent presences of the other in the form of the revenant, the haunting, the phantom, the specter, all of these sort of neo-Gothic vocabulary that crowd the Derrida's work from the 90s. And which I would say is anticipated in Heidegger's sort of dense but short phenomenology of the dead other. The fact that Heidegger mentions burial as a particularly important example of what it means to continue to be with the dead as somehow still an intersubjective coexistence and not just the handling of things, it led me when I sort of decided to explore this track and see what I could do with it. How could I develop an argument that sort of takes this question of the culture of death and the continued communal existence with the dead into a larger argument that has to do precisely with the phenomenon of history and historicity. It led me then to start reading up on the literature, the anthropological and archaeological on burial practices, which is of course an enormous archive. I mean, if you start opening the doors to 19th century anthropology and history of religion, you have an infinite amount of often fascinating descriptions of the various ways in which humans have buried. And the fact that burial seems to be a universal fact among all human communities on Earth, as long back as the archaeological record goes, makes it, of course, an extraordinary, fascinating phenomena to think about. What is it we do when we bury? So I go at great length, actually, in the book to interpret and bring together this material. I cannot speak of it more today because there's not time. We can discuss it maybe afterwards. But my point in doing it is to sort of use this, all of these collected experience of various ways in which humans continue to care for and be with their dead into the context of a larger argument about historical culture. In this exploration of sort of trying to think burial in a larger philosophical context, I didn't find very many philosophical sources, very few actually, who had written about it, but with one striking counterexample, which is actually Hegel, who raises the topic of the meaning of burial in a few short but very, I would say, decisive sections in the phenomenology of spirit. And he interprets their burial as a particular work of the spirit that seeks to give meaning and context to the brute force of finitude, where the family experiences it as their task to bestow a kind of retroactive freedom and spiritual force to the family members who have been torn away by death. Hegel's fascination with this theme and its philosophical significance is obviously connected to his fascination with the figure of Antigone and Sophocles' drama that he would keep coming back to all throughout his life. And I also refer to Antigone in various sections of my book and also other aspects of the of Sophocles' characters. I speak of her as a necropolitical heroine, which is my term for describing her strange ethical and political commitment to the dead rather than to the living. And one of the most startling aspects of the dialogue between her and her sister in the play, between Antigone and Ismene, has to do with when she says that, when she tries to defend her choice of challenging the king's verdict and thereby risking death penalty for just strewing dust on the corpse of her dead brother Polynicus, she says to her sister, since I will do this, since I have to spend more time with those in Hades than those who live here. So she projects her own ethical persona on a time scale where the being with the dead is of much, much greater ethical and political significance than the short time she will have with the remaining family members. So her ethical orientation is directed toward the deceased rather than to the living, and towards what she experienced as a claim coming from them. And since from the perspective of the living, Antigone, from this perspective, is, I mean, half mad. It's as if she's lost an orientation and commitment to the living, and she's drifting towards a space where she's hardly even communicating with them anymore when she pushes aside her sister who is pleading her to stay. And but of course, the distinction between madness and reason is here as clear cut as it would seem from, for example, the point of view of Creon, the king, for whom she's just a crazy girl who is prepared to die for burial. Because even Tiresias, who is an important figure in the drama, the seer, eventually he also sides with Antigone's sensibility. He notes that the gods are displeased by Creon's decision to punish Polynicus with not getting a burial for having then mobilized an army and marched against Thebes. And Tiresias tried to calm Creon and convince him that he must consider not just the living but also the dead, and indicating that the failure to do so is itself a form of madness. And he writes then, the self will incur the charge of folly. And he says, nay, you must allow the claim of the dead. And as we know, Creon do not allow the claim of the dead. And for this too, he is punished severely by tragic fate in the drama. You will recall his fate, that in the end, he loses his entire family. So in its literary mythical form, the drama of Antigone could be read as articulating a more general problem, namely how the relation to the dead constitutes a space of meaning within which the living constantly move, and that they must try to balance and master through ritual and proper comportment, but also through myth and song and accounts. And it's fascinating then to think that this drama is written more or less at the same time as Herodotus' Historia, and the depiction of the emergence of the Persian Wars, or the background of it. In view of this contemporaneity, it's striking, I think, that Herodotus articulates his own motivation at the outset of his book. So as mentioned earlier, it is oriented, it says, by a concern for the dead to preserve their memory, making the historical writing itself into almost a kind of sacrificial event. And when looking for the phenomenological meaning of the historical, I therefore suggest then that we locate it at the juncture where the living turn toward the dead, taking responsibility for their afterlife by building monuments to their lives and thus internalizing life that has been. The crypt into which Antigone then goes voluntarily as punishment would therefore almost be like a metonym for the space where history is conceived. It is a crypt which for her means that she moves across this threshold, but that she enters it, she's still alive. And as being alive, she's speaking to and taking responsibility for the dead and having opened herself to their claims. I said at the outset that I would eventually return then to that famous other scene from early Greek literature, the Odyssey, and the hero's visit to the land of the dead. This is described in Book 11, that's also sometimes referred to as the Nekia, the travel to the dead. The background of this story, as most of you will also remember, is that Odysseus and his men, after they have spent a very long time on the island of Kirke, she advises them in order to finally get back home, first to go to Teiresias in Hades to find out about their future prospects. So it's for this reason, to meet Teiresias, that Odysseus sails with his ship to the limits of the sea, to the land of the winter people who live in constant darkness. And on a specific spot indicated by Kirke, he digs a hole in the ground and he performs the sacrificial rite, the culmination of which is the pouring of blood from a newly slaughtered lamb. And this blood then calls forth the spirits who, when they drink the blood, will be permitted to leave their shadowy existence for a moment and to see and speak with the living. And the first person who rushes up to Odysseus after he's done the rites is his own rowing mate, Elpenor, this miserable little man whom they thought they had left behind because he was so drunk that he was still sleeping, but he fell from the roof and he broke his neck. So he's traveled directly to Hades even before his comrades. And he pledges then Odysseus to provide him with a grave, to go back and take care of his body so that he will not be forgotten. And then after the meeting with the Elpenor, he sees Teiresias in Hades. And the literary encounter between Odysseus and Teiresias is really quite a remarkable scene, where the communication with the dead, the blood sacrifice, and how this also enables us to see better into the future all come together. Because in the discourse that follows, Teiresias tells Odysseus of the different possible fates that await him depending on how he acts. The future is not decided. It's not deterministic. It still depends on how they will handle the current situation. And during the course of this conversation with Teiresias, Odysseus can also see the shadow of his own mother, who's sort of roaming around there and behind. And she's first unaware of his presence. And then Teiresias explained to him how it is with the dead. He says, I shall make it clear in a few words and simply. Any dead man whom you allow to enter where the blood is will speak to you and speak the truth. But those deprived will grow remote again and fade. And we can read these words as a kind of testimony of a basic phenomenological hermeneutic dimension of history. It's only by giving something of ourselves, of our own life power to those who are no longer here, that they will be able to speak back to us. If not, they will remain faint and silent shadows. The encounter with his mother that then follows is extraordinarily moving and one of the most famous literary scenes in the history of Western literature. Because when he enters the world of the dead, Odysseus does not know that his mother is dead, right? He thinks that he's still traveling home to meet her. So when she drinks from the sacrificial blood, she begins to speak and she tells him how she died from the grief of longing to see him. And when he desperately stretches out to hug her, she disappears into thin air. And this would then be this story you will remember also from Virgil will then make a version of it also in the Aeneid, and it's been redone in many versions, but this one is extraordinarily powerful. But after Odysseus has spoken then to his mother and tried to hug her, the other shadows come forward. And they are all very eager to drink the blood because they want to tell their stories. They want him to know what has happened to them because they see him as a possible witness to the living. And he's standing there with his sword, and from first having sought the company of the dead and listened to them, he's now having to discipline them, and he says, and sort of letting them speak and bear witness one at a time, and they then come up and they all tell what they have done. So Agamemnon, Achilles, and all of his friends. So it's as if Homer here establishes the format of a kind of narrative that opens a space for the historian, whose narrative will emerge in the centuries that follow. Like Odysseus in the fictive narrative, the historian tries to preserve and bear witness from the dead of their origin and their deeds. And the sacrificing storyteller emerges in this very particular and formative scene as somebody who establishes the genre of history as a narrated recollection of the dead. And as the presumed writer, it is of course Homer who controls this narrative from start to end. Yet we can also see how the literary composition prepares the way for the historian to come. For it is not the bard, the one that I mentioned at the outset, who sings the songs of the Trojan Wars. It's not to him that Alcinous wants to listen when he wants to know more about the heroes from Troy and what has happened. No, it is the voices of the heroes themselves, as they have spoken to the one who has traveled across the threshold into the land of the dead, bringing back not tales, but truth. Not just mythoi, but aletes. This is the literary, the actual term in the narrative. So Alcinous says, I don't want to listen to the bard. I want to hear to you because you have been there. You have heard them. You know the truth, not the myths. So as Odysseus describes his encounter with Agamemnon, Achilles, and the others who have all died, he then begins every passage almost like sort of a rhythmical voicing. He says, and I saw. He's using various versions of the verb, adon, ace adon, I saw, interchangeably. So it's as if Odysseus here is a kind of exemplary histor, the one who has seen, the one who carries witness back to the living from what he has seen, from what the dead have said to him, as a seeing witness for the witnesses. There is an article in the History and Theory Journal from 2000 where François Hartog explicitly analyzes the relation between Herodotus and Homer. And Hartog's argument is that Herodotus actually, when he started his project, his main rival was Homer and the bards. So when he first started writing his Historia, he wanted to compete with the epic poets. But in the end, it turned out that he had created himself a unique kind of discourse in a new voice. Hartog's comparison between Herodotus and Homer does not engage with any of the details of the text. It moves on a more general comparison between them as two forms of narratives of ancient wars and deeds. But I think it's when we look at the specific passages that I have recalled here that his argument obtains an even deeper significance. It's not just a question of a certain hypothetical intertextual relation and influence between these texts. More important, I would say, is the existential situation and predicament of Odysseus as the storyteller, the historian, of what it can also say to us about the phenomenon of the historical as such. Seen from this perspective, the Homeric epic anticipates the possibility of historical narrative in its combination of travel recollection and sacrificial rites for the dead. And the somewhat sort of the moving and somewhat pathetic account of this poor rower Elpenor who fell drunk from the roof also, I think, obtains a deeper significance in the light of this interpretation, because Elpenor is the first person that Odysseus meets in Hades. And he's the first one of which he gives an account to his hosts when he tells the story of his travel. And the central point in this narrative is not that he died, which is true, of course, of everyone in Hades, but that Elpenor was left behind unburied. What he demands from Odysseus and his friends, what he asks for and pleads for, is that they go back and provide him with a grave. In other words, a memorial mound through which he can be remembered. So his last wish from the other side in the land of the dead is that the living should erect for him a sign that he has lived. And after having finished his story about the land of the dead, Odysseus also tells his hosts that he did indeed return to erect a grave mound for poor Elpenor. Even this miserable little rower received a burial mound where he stuck his oar into the ground to show that he had existed. This act, I would say, has a kind of metonymic function in the narrative, where the act of memory and burial and the tale of his life and destiny overlap. And even by giving his testimony and his account of these people that he's met, Odysseus has also performed a kind of symbolic burial. The story describes how Elpenor has not been forgotten, how even this insignificant man has been preserved for the future and given a life in the memory of the living. And the scene with Odysseus then with the dead permits us to reflect on the existential foundations for historical awareness, but also on the prerequisite for historical narratives. And before ending now shortly, I just want to make one more point in relation to this remarkable literary account, as also a way of tying together a few different dimensions here in my argument. Because it's often said about the Greeks' relation to the dead, that unlike other and many other cultural configurations, the relation to the dead is mostly one of pity. The dead live in a land of shadows. They are deprived of force of life. And in the images from Odysseus' encounter during the sacrificial communication with the dead, this is also mostly the case. They are indeed miserable. Even the great Agamemnon and Achilles, the hero, so strong in life, here appear simply as depressed weaklings, where Achilles, as you remember the famous quote, he says he would rather be guarding cattle or pigs among the living than walk around in Hades. But as they come forth to tell their stories, Odysseus can treat them like one would treat almost little children. He asks them to get in line. He holds up his sword. He says, okay, now it's your turn to tell your story and to carry witness. But then something happened towards the end of this scene where the atmosphere suddenly changes. The rumor has spread among the dead that there is someone there. There's a place where they can tell their stories, that there is a witness, and they begin to crowd around this sacrificial pond. And at this moment, Odysseus is gripped by anxiety and almost fear that he will not be able to control the situation. He feels that maybe Persephone will send upon him the Gorgo head, that gaze from the other side that can transform one and kill oneself. So the situation becomes frightening, and he realizes that he's not safe himself from the dead, that they can also engulf him and draw him back into their world. And he sort of whips around with his sword and then departs, leaving their voices and claims behind. And through this end, the story, I would say, also captures another side of the relation to the past as a relation to the dead. Because through the proper sacrificial rites, humans can come into contact with the underworld and with the testimonies and the stories from the dead. But if one stays too long and if one listens too closely, it's not only the living who's looking at the dead, but also the dead who are looking at the living, risking to transform them into the object of their fateful gaze. Too much history, too many voices from the past can make somebody to one dead among the living. This is at least a way of interpreting this dramatic scene. Let me then, with last paragraph, end by recalling a modern classic in the theory of history, Michel de Certeau's collection of essays, The Writing of History, that came out in 1975 in Paris. Here the author quotes a short and posthumously published manuscript by the great French 19th century historian Jules Michelet, entitled L'héroïsme de l'esprit, the heroism of the spirit. In this text that was prepared as a postscript to his great history of France, but not published, so it was found among in his archive, Michelet describes his own journey as historian as a journey into the, I quote, graves and sepulchres of the dead. He imagines how the souls of the dead through his own work have now, quote, returned less saddened to their tombs. For Certeau, this remarkable testimony from one of the greatest modern historians opens the door to a general understanding of history as precisely operating on the threshold of the living and the dead. And Certeau writes, the other is the phantasm of historiography, the object that it seeks, honors, and buries, a labor of separation concerning this uncanny and fascinating proximity is effected. So Certeau sees Michelet positing himself at this border where literature has erected its fiction of journeys to the land of the dead. But in doing so and in fantasizing about the possibility of bringing them back and saving their voices, he is in fact instituting what for Certeau is the fundamental historical operation, which is not just the communication with the dead, but also the effort to calm the dead, as he writes, who still haunt the present, and at offering them scriptural tombs. So what historiography accomplishes is to create, through its writing, ultimately a separation between the living and the dead. Certeau mentions both Virgil and Dante as literary examples of such fictions of journeys to the land of the dead, even though for some reason he doesn't mention Homer, which is the arch version of this story and by far the most dramatic version of it. From my reading here, we can see, I think, how its narrative can be used to illustrate to an even greater degree the birth of the historical, precisely in its description of Odysseus' encounter with the dead. Because in the end, the hero must use his sword to fend off the spirits of the dead as they come too close. He is their caretaker. He has sacrificed blood in order to let them speak, and he has carried their testimonies over into the land of the living. But in doing so, he is also the one who has had to institute a cut to forge a separation between the claims of the dead and the needs of the living. It's on this threshold that history continues to operate, in a commitment to the voices and memories of the dead while controlling their potentially dangerous claim on the living. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans, for your very stimulating paper. I'll now open the floor to questions, but I might jump in first and just ask, in what sense do you derive a sense of historical meaning from a relation between the living and the dead, especially in the context of Odysseus talking to Achilles, not talking to his mother, but talking to other dead people in Hades? Does he derive a sense of historical meaning from that process? And is that then characteristic of, I suppose, the Greek tradition all the way down to Plutarch, where tales of the past are designed or told in order to produce a sense of historical meaning?
So my point would be that in the power of the narrative that describes the genuine encounter with the dead, I think summarizes the deeper aspiration of historical understanding as issuing from a desire to hold on to them, to bring them back, and in a sense to be able to communicate with them. And this I would point to as the core meaning that this literary narrative captures.
Perfect, thank you. Lawrence?
Hans, thank you so much for that paper. I mean, there's so many things that I would like to talk to you about, but it's not my place to hog this space. I'm really struck by what you bring to life with your classical references. And there's two passages of Heidegger have haunted me in the last 5 months. One from a text that's almost unknown by him. It's a lecture that was only recently published, written in, it's not even clear for whom or it was written or to whom it was given, if it was even ever delivered. But it was given, it was prepared in somewhere around the end of 1944 or beginning of 1945, called Von der Vergessenheit, on forgetfulness, where he makes a claim that he also makes in relation to Parmenides, and that is that forgottenness depends on what is present. and not the other way around, that we assume, as it were, that forgottenness lies like a dark circumference around the edge of everything that is present. And he says this is absolutely not correct, that it is the present which allows forgetting to be forgotten. And this seems to me to open a question, a level of two kinds of forgottenness. And if I give you the other example, we have here in the UK a monument that everyone will know of called Stonehenge. And I hate going there. I hate going there because it's been set upon by the archaeologists and the cultural historians who fill it with texts that say, you know, it's possible that it could have happened. An arrowhead like this may have been used in the vicinity. In other words, we need actually to allow ourselves to name the fact that this is a forgotten thing. We do not know to whom it belonged. We know that it belongs to people who are no longer present, who were usurped or pressed aside by other influxes. So that there are two levels of forgottenness here. And I thought, for me, it's really more of an observation, but I'd love you to comment. Because it seems to me that only the living can have a past. This is this is the resonance I get from your paper. And this is a difficult thing for us to consider, because in as much as you are able to bring these classical references to life, you do, it seems to me, what Heidegger himself so often does, and what he claims Hölderlin is doing. He reaches into the continuing presencing of the Greeks in the presence of our own understanding in order for us to gain access, actually, ourselves to Hades. You know, and there are other similar accounts that echo this. I'm thinking of the last 8 lines of Pindar's 8th Pythian Ode, which is full of references to all the passages that you were referring to. This is an uncomfortable understanding of history, because it means actually answering the question who we are, and answering it with respect to a historical presencing. And so this abolishes the notion of either history as something universal or global, but rather as something that particularizes and that singles us out. And you also name the dangers in that it can overwhelm us and engulf us. So I leave that there, but I mean, I'd love to know whether you think that resonates.
Yeah, sure. It resonates in many ways. I'm not sure which of the many threads I should pick up on. Maybe now, of course, my main background sources were these famous narratives, and of course they are a hugely important resonance. But my sort of the overall aspiration of the argument that I develop in the book is something that I would like to think of myself as a kind of more general phenomenological a priori, almost in the Husserl sense, as I tried to think that there is something about the how humans carry on the life of the others in the community, which need not necessarily be transformed into literature, because many cultures don't have written literature, and certainly not into the discourse of history in the modern sense. But there is a way in which what we refer to as historical awareness and historical consciousness that can be interpreted against the background of this more general experience of caring for those who are no longer there. So in that sense, for this reason, I have many references to cultures outside the scope of the Western imagination, and how such examples also activate the connection between historical awareness and a sense of historical community, transgenerational historical community that is not restricted to this cultural space. I mean, but that just answers one aspect of your question. The what you refer to with the example of Stonehenge is, of course, the eagerness with which our historical culture grasps for an interpretation on the basis of always limited evidence in order to recreate it. And if that is your point, I mean, I agree with you fully. It's frustrating to see this sort of the greed with which historical interpretation claims to usurp the past as it is. The fact that you cannot stand in this space as a space that is that also contains its own enigma, but it's a space that has to do with a certain experience of time that archaeology or historical interpretation can never consume or absorb fully. Yeah, but those are just two reflections. We will have to maybe get back to the Heidegger text. I never read this text that you mentioned. I want to look at it. So maybe we can have this conversation in a exchange later.
Chiara?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, for this interesting work. I have a question regarding ancient Greek literature, as you mentioned, Homer. So when you spoke about this dialogue between the afterlife and the heroes of the present, it may, as a tool of making sense of a history. So something came to my mind. I thought of Empedocles and this theory of metempsychosis, and that is clearly an example of how he makes use of this relationship between this life and the afterlife to make sense of a history, because by saying that everybody is the reincarnated soul of someone else, it basically self-portray. It makes a self-portrayal of his poetic persona as someone who has a higher level of knowledge. So I was wondering if you believe that Empedocles could have somehow could be read as a historical voice. So do you think that by flattening these boundaries between this life and the afterlife through the transmigration theory, it could have put himself in the position to make the claim, the same claim as historians like Herodotus or other historians of his time?
Thank you so much for posing this question. I cannot answer it immediately, but I'm so grateful for this for various reasons, because I've been thinking about Empedocles in a different context recently. But intuitively, I would like to say immediately that you're right. I think there's definitely something there, and it would bring us also into Plato as a philosopher of historical awareness through his reworking of this theme. But so I can just thank you for the suggestion. I will continue to think about it. I think you're right.
Okay, thank you. And can I take the opportunity to ask another quick question?
Yeah.
Because I was thinking about other ancient cultures, but also modern cultures who have this different sense of time, which is a cyclical time rather than a linear time. So do you think that this may have a different impact on the way they make sense of history? So the way in which different cultures see time in a linear way or in a cyclical way can make a difference in their perception of history. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's only with the linear time that you have the idea of a progressing history, of course, which creates a different kind of narrative and a different kind of experience of what has been. So I think that's a very decisive difference, and one that has been thematized also by the theoreticians of historical consciousness, people like Koselleck and others. So no, I think it's highly important. Whether or not how it actually how it mirrors or plays into different versions of how we place the dead. I'd like to think a little bit more about that, because I can just add, since to your question, maybe a side remark, because when thinking about this, I've also, I mean, I try to think about what is the problem that we solve through our own secularized model of history, where we think of the past as somehow a huge container where everything that has happened in a certain sense is. And maybe if we compare it, for example, to the Egyptian culture, I mean, the single longest existing culture, sort of with a shared historical memory in sort of this Asman sense, was the Egyptians. And it's, of course, it's a fascinating riddle that this culture that existed for 3,000 years in a recognizable shape, with a literature and a ritual, that it never developed historiography of any significance, apart from simple lists of pharaohs. So they did not. It was a culture that was excessively preoccupied with where the dead are, but it didn't place them within this historical narrative. But in our secular culture, it's as if we have invented a new space, which is the space of history, that solves a question that all cultures must somehow deal with, namely the response to where are the dead? And if we don't place them anywhere, they become disturbing and they become haunting, because we feel they are somewhere. And it's if history solves this question, and especially so, and linear history is a progressive movement that sort of leaves behind a growing space of those which have been. And it's as if we know now where they are, and this comforts us, and we can walk over there and we can be with them as much as we want by studying the archives and collecting the evidence and even reburying their bodies in our historical museums and their archives. So we have developed a number of techniques that deal with a problem that I think every culture has to deal with, but this is our way of dealing with it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Bob?
Yes, thanks, Hans, very much. I very much enjoyed the paper for several reasons I would take a half hour to get into. But you know me, you know that anytime anybody talks about Heidegger and historicity, I'm going to listen. And I do have, I think I can bring together a bunch of concerns I have by one simple example. At the beginning of this section on temporality and historicity, Heidegger gives this sort of innocent question about, you know, this thing lying in a museum is not just is a thing, or is it, what is it? And long story short, it has to be contextualized, because it's not just a thing, it's a human thing, and it comes with a world, and right, we all know that.
Yeah.
But what's important to me is that he poses that as a problem. And that is then followed by several sections in which he explains how, before we start talking about history, we better understand what it means to be historical. I think that's really important in general for Heidegger, of course, but also in light of what you do in your paper. I think your literary examples are very good examples of what it's like when you speak from your understanding of being historical. That is, when you recognize yourself to be a historical being, and you are then in a position to understand and interpret even cultures very remote from your own by reconstructing what it's like to have a past as well as to have knowledge of a past. That's the distinction that our culture doesn't know how to make very well. In fact, if STEM education is to be any indication of it, it would rather not make the distinction. It would rather simply know knowledge, know history, have knowledge of it that we can then apply. So whatever direct connection there is between human beings and the past would be mediated by our instrumental knowledge of what to do with it. I'm almost done. If I now go line by line through your paper, 90% of the time, you speak from history, not about it. You speak from the central sections of the historicity chapter, not from the first two. If you see what I mean, right? It's an objective voice that says, what could that be besides a thing? And then draw in what they know about the human condition to contextualize it. Analytic philosophers are doing a lot of that these days. They're saying, oh, you know, we've given up, we abandoned history too soon. We need to contextualize our thoughts, but they're doing that from the outside as somebody who knows what it is like to contextualize something, not by speaking from history and giving us an account of what they think their inheritance is on the basis of their predecessors. There is one place where you say something that can't be right, or at least can't be left alone. And that is where you say that Homer opens a space for historians. You see the problem. For historiographers, not so much. For people who are aware of what it is to be historical, yes, definitely. And it's not that I think those two are so far apart that they have nothing to contribute to each other, but they go with different modes of being. And especially in a culture like ours that doesn't really recognize any mode of being except the objective one in any explicit cultural way, that can be important. What do you think?
But just to make sure that we are on the same page, would you say if the question is how to reach into the mindset of somebody who doesn't think from within history, but who thinks from the outside, what would be then the appropriate pedagogy? I mean, it's clear, isn't it, that a certain sense of the historical, I would say from sort of this phenomenological sensibility, has to do with a sense of being already from the start in a position of dependency. And if you don't have that experience, if you experience yourself as completely solid and as a self-contained observer of what is outside you, then you will have a lesser historical. You will not. Yes, this is the point that you're making. Yeah. Okay. But I would certainly agree, and we know many such people, and it's difficult to have deeper conversations about this if you have not this sensibility of your own belonging. But what would I mean, what would the appropriate counter strategy be? Because you imply also with your question that there was a movement from the earlier to the later sections in the chapter, and that I didn't really follow. Are you saying that there is a way that this could be done, that could somehow also bring those less sensitive people into the argument. Is that what you're saying, or?
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of any particular example about that, except the way that Heidegger starts that section on historicity is one of those examples.
Yeah.
And that is by showing how deep a problem this thing lying in a museum without a context really is philosophically. If you begin to think about it, the payoff is going to be when you see the point of having to add a context, and then somebody asks you, well, how do you know to do that? What would make you think it needs a context? Why shouldn't it just be laying there as a thing and we analyze it as a thing? You know that as a historical being. Yeah. And if you then tap what it is that you already understand enough to be able to see the need for a context, that already is an opening.
Yeah. But I often use Heidegger's example in sort of more introductory type of lectures, because I think it's excellent, because everybody has this experience of going to an historical museum and looking at things that are presumably historical artifacts, because it's a kind of cultural ritual that we are so familiar with from childhood that we just accept it. But by sort of placing this very common experience, a kind of epoche around it, and saying, okay, what is it? The thing that you're looking at is clearly here. It is not elsewhere. It is only here now before you. Why do you experience this as historical? And I think this is there's a good pedagogic step from there, where you can begin to slowly sort of unpack or disentangle this sort of objectified way of using these concepts. So if that is what you are also stressing, I'm in complete agreement.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more quick question, Luke.
Thanks. Thanks for the paper, Hans. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, a little bit louder if you have. Do you have a stronger mic? Yeah.
I'll try and.
It's okay. I'll listen. It's okay. It's okay. Yeah.
I'll try and stay as close as I can. So, I guess I just wanted to ask you to say a bit more about the contemporary context. You've talked a lot about ancient Greece, but this idea of a phenomenology of being with the dead as a kind of human universal. You seem to suggest in what you said in response to Chiara that the content of that phenomenology can vary very widely depending on the particular civilization that you're dealing with. So, what is, as it were, our version of it? Because you used the word ancestrality, which I like, but it seems to me that in contemporary modernity, we have a very confused consciousness of ancestrality. In one way, we've never had so many representations of pastness via popular culture, film and TV and so on. But in another way, the whole progressive orientation of modernity tends to sort of lead to discounting the past and sort of not regarding ourselves as connected to it. Yeah. And so there's that problem. And then also, more globally, who are my ancestors in a modern context, given we now know via sort of genetic anthropology, we all go back to some people in Africa or what have you, whereas what somebody like Heidegger presumably has in mind is more Volkish, as it were. But is that the right, is there a right answer here, or are these things in tension with one another? It just seems like this, working out how this all plays out in a contemporary context is very complex, and I just wondered what thoughts you might have on how this works today.
Yeah, I mean that's of course a huge issue, but to pick up a few threads, I mean, since while developing this argument, I was situated within this multidisciplinary group that Aron mentioned in his introduction. So I was working very closely with historians, intellectual historians, and anthropologists and archaeologists. So there was a way in which I was sort of testing these phenomenological matrices also on people who actually engaged in research. And I felt it resonated very well, and especially with archaeologists, who are of course the most sort of scientific among the historical disciplines, that there is a validity in this way in which even though we like to think about history as a scientific, methodologically rigorous exploration of the past as the sum total of the objective that has been, there is of course a way in which in all our historical pursuits we are orienting ourselves within the larger space of precisely the world of the has-been, putting our gaze from one aspect of it to the other in terms of whom we also are seeking to bring into our present. So there is a way in which the historical narrative or the historical aspiration is connected to this a kind of ancestral desire, and you can of course see it in the I mean, this was among the 19th century historians, as we know, with the whole sort of the nationalist narrative, this was very obvious. Then with the critique of the nationalist 19th century narrative, it became more dispersed. But on the other hand, if almost whichever historian one speaks to, there is always a kind of underlying pathos that is directed towards those whom one seeks to revivify or address or bring back into the present, which makes, at least, I mean, makes this kind of interpretive matrix into I think, a better space for discussing between history and philosophy than sort of the narrativist version that more take an interest in sort of the forms in which historical narratives is produced, the whole epistemological issues, because this immediately directs us towards the ethical and political commitment of the historian in a way that my experience, at least, many historians can easily identify with. And it can be whether or not you turn your historical eye towards, I mean, the victims of this or that genocide, or as today, sort of the victims of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. There is, or the historians that are working under undemocratic conditions, where it's very clear that certain people should not be allowed back into the present, and where the historical task is precisely one of almost in revolt against the silence and forgetting of the present, to keep a door open to those victims of the past who are not allowed in. So all of those, which, I mean, for a contemporary historian, I think are very clear problems, I think you can discuss within this framework. That would be my short version of an answer, but there are many more things to say about it, of course.
Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank Hans again for his tremendous paper. Thank you to everyone for coming along today, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.